Good evening. My name is Vivian Sandlin, and I've been a member of this church, I don't know how it happened, about 20 years, and never regretted a moment of it. It's been wonderful, so thank you so much. We're really glad you're here. And when I tell you the story, you'll really see how fortunate we are to all be here, because there was a time when we weren't sure we were going to be. And I want to thank Kathy Slater for leading us in planning the 150th anniversary. Reverend Melissa, thank you so much for supporting this effort and being here for us and encouraging us along the way. Members of the 150th anniversary committee who've already stood up, Elaine and Bill Bowen for the food downstairs that we will enjoy afterwards. They always prepare delicious food. I also want to thank those who have researched and worked to organize the records of our church history. Paula Copestick is a former member who moved away to Florida, 10 years ago. And she just did a great deal of work in researching, and in 1890 she put on a performance, a reenactment of women in the church, in our church history. And I don't know we couldn't find her, we were looking for her, but we want to honor her. Dave Brown, who has been organizing and archiving our records. And Sally Burnell has been our unofficial church historian, and she has devoted many hours to digging through our records, which were thrown in closets and tossed all about and sort of crunched up. And what's this? What's this tucked behind here? And now we're finally getting them in order, and what Sally has been working to make sense of them all, and that's very exciting. I want to also thank Renee Rahutsky, who really worked very hard to plan this presentation, and who actually was the main writer of our drama that we will be performing. Finally, we thank the Kent 150th anniversary players assembled here. Very talented group.
Part 1, the founding.
On this day, 150 years ago, May 27th, 1866, 19 men and women gathered in the Kent Village Hall next door to where we are and formed themselves into a new religious community. They wrote and signed a constitution, and they called themselves the First Universalist Church of Kent. They declared in their new constitution the following: "We claim the right to interpret the scriptures in the fear of God and according to the light he has given us, and we accord to all others the same right. We therefore disavow all right to enforce our standard of faith on the conscience of others by pains and penalties, moral or physical." Today, we celebrate our 150th birthday as a congregation. Our name has changed, our numbers have grown, our theology has evolved, and our spirit remains as strong as it was on this day 150 years ago. We also remain committed, as our founders were, to freedom of conscience in our beliefs and to the spread of universal compassion and universal love. We are today the inheritors, the safekeepers, and the promoters of their legacy of hope, of free thought, and of compassion for all. Happy birthday, UU Church of Kent. All this coming year, our church will sponsor celebratory events focused on our 150 years of covenant with each other and service to the wider community. We're opening here today with a celebration of our past as we remember and honor our ancestors who made us who we are and who have left us with their legacy of their religious liberal vision. Come, let us remember and celebrate together. Now, those 19 men and women who gathered on May 27th to covenant with each other had recently lived through a terrible civil war. Ohioans played a big role in the Union cause in that war and in the anti-slavery activism that preceded it. Before the war, Northeast Ohio provided significant stops for passengers on the Underground Railroad who were headed for Canada. Anti-slavery societies met in villages around the region. The famous or infamous John Brown, who led the bloody raid on the federal arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, lived in Hudson and part of the time here in Kent. James A. Garfield, principal of the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute in Hiram, raised a regiment from Portage County to fight for the Union in Kentucky. Garfield went on to be elected President of the United States in 1880, and then he was shot. In all, nearly 316,000 Ohioans served in the Union Army, including some 5,000 African American troops from Ohio. Ohioans fought in every battle of the war in more than 260 Union regiments. More than 11,000 Ohio soldiers died from wounds suffered in battle, while over 13,000 died from disease. Women and men from around our region volunteered to try to save lives and nurse the wounded in the war. One of them was a surgeon from Franklin Mills, which is what Kent was called before it was Kent. His name was Dr. Aaron M. Sherman. The Sherman family had moved from Brimfield, Massachusetts to Brimfield Township, Ohio in 1831. Aaron Sherman studied medicine at Western Reserve College, and he began his medical practice in Garrettsville. He and his wife moved to Franklin Mills in 1857. And he would, as Sally said, become the longest resident of the recently restored Wells Sherman House on Water Street. When the Civil War broke out, Dr. Sherman served as an assistant surgeon at Lincoln General Hospital in Washington, D.C. The hospital consisted of a mixture of pavilions and tents, yes, tents, where doctors tried desperately to save the lives of the wounded. Dr. Sherman returned home from the war determined to create a church home dedicated to the universality of God's love. He and his fellow church founders hoped to heal the wounds of war, to serve God, and to spread good works and God's love throughout the community.
1865. The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
I'm Dr. A.M. Sherman, and I'm a pretty good surgeon. I've been patching up troops in the Army of the Union. The war's now over, and it's time to pack my tent, home to the Cuyahoga and my little town of Kent.
1866.
Fire and brimstone and the gates of hell. That's what some churches preach. That's what some churches sell. The
world is not the same.
The world is going to change. We want a different kind of church, one that's based on God's love. We want a different kind of church where God accepts all up above. Fire and
brimstone and the gates of hell. That's what some churches preach. That's what some churches sell. The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
We want a different kind of church, one that wants to save all. We want a different kind of church where God's love is universal. Let's found a different kind of church with universal salvation, a loving kind of church that will be ready for the long run.
The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
We've got the Strattons and the Olins, the Boosingers and Parsons, Haymakers, Wrights, and Whitcombs, Russells, Merrills, and Marshalls. We've got the Furries and the Bradleys.
We're ready to join Dr. Sherman to found a new kind of church right here in Kent to practice universalism. Universalism had swept through the Western Reserve in the early 19th century. Followers of John Murray moved into the region from Pennsylvania and founded small Universalist societies in rural communities. A Universalist church was founded in Brimfield in 1839 and in Ravenna in 1842. Universalists believe that all are saved, that no one is condemned, that the central message of Christ is that God is love. The 19 founders of our church were among the earliest white settlers of the community, and their families were some of the founders of Franklin Mills. Prominent among our church founders was James Haymaker, owner of a grist mill in town. The Haymakers were the first white family to settle here in 1805. James Haymaker had been an abolitionist before the war. He married Mary Rosetta Olin from the Olin family, who were also church founders. Reverend Andrew Wilson served as the church's first minister, and that right there is his Bible, his actual Bible from 1868. And his record book as well is there. Reverend Wilson preached in a sermon that the small size of a congregation did not matter. He said, "The success is to be estimated by the loyalty and spirit of its members, by the love and goodwill that they manifest toward each other and the world. The members of the First Universalist Church of Kent met in different locations around the village at first. They sought a location to build a permanent church. The railroad tycoon Marvin Kent donated this land beside the village hall for the construction of a new church building. Dr. Sherman chaired a committee to raise funds from people in the local community. They raised about $17,000, which is the equivalent of about $280,000 today. The congregation hired a carpenter named Joseph Gridley, who constructed the church building in which we sit. The story is that he fashioned the bricks from the soil dug up to create the foundation. On August 23, 1868, the people of the church dedicated the new Universalist Meeting House in a glorious service.
1868.
We've got a congregation, we've got a constitution, we've been doing some cultivation, we've been doing faith formation. We've got faith, hope, and charity. We've got gospel, truth, and light. We've got a vision for the future. What we need is a building site.
We just need a building site.
We've got Andrew Wilson's preaching, we've got trustees, we've got deacons. We may be overreaching, but we need a building site.
We just need a building site.
Good news.
Good news.
We have a benefactor. He's a railroad contractor. He has lots of tracts of land here. Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
This news will make you shiver. There's a plot of land he'll give here on the west side of the river. Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
It's time for building planning. Red bricks will be enchanting. Universalism expanding. Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
With sanctuary and tall steeple, this meeting house is for the people. In this church, we are all equal. Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
Hip, hip, hooray for Marvin Kent.
Part 2, Women in the Lead, the late 19th century.
In 1893, Aaron Sherman reflected on the quarter century that had passed since the dedication of the little church building. He declared, "Nothing is truer in human or divine government than that love begets love and hatred begets hatred. We at once see the importance of cultivating and developing our minds. Can we afford to neglect the better part of our nature, the affectional part, that which is spiritual, born of the Great Spirit? We have had 25 years of universalism in Kent. Does anyone regret it? There is room for all the churches here and work for all. Let all rejoice in each other's prosperity." In its first 3 decades, the First Universalist Church grew in membership and in influence in the community. Women were especially active in serving the congregation and in working for social justice. In 1889, the First Universalist Church of Kent called its first woman minister. Her name was Abigail Danforth. She hoped to make both the church and the wider society a welcoming home for all. Abby Danforth oversaw significant work on the church building. She organized repair of the roof, replacement of seats and carpets, and the addition of wallpaper to cover up the soot left by the coal furnace. Abby Danforth was also an activist for women's suffrage. According to one story, which may be apocryphal, she led a group of women to the Opera House on Election Day, November 4th, 1890, to hear Universalist minister Olympia Brown speak on the need for women to have the vote.
1889.
Can a woman be a minister? They seem kind of frail. Have you seen our woman minister? She's the amazing Abigail.
Abigail Danforth is my name, but you can call me Abby. This church was built with lots of care, but now it's kind of shabby. See our church in disrepair? Dirt and coal dust everywhere. This isn't good space for worship or for prayer. We don't want folks to go elsewhere. This church needs some renovation. It needs carpet on its foundation and some stencils for decoration. This building needs more admiration.
The world is
Not the same. The world is going to change. We believe in love that's open and free for all God's people universally. Now our building is in ship shape. Our forward motion we can't escape. It's the world we need to shape. Now don't stand there all agape. Women's suffrage is our great cause. We need to change some unjust laws. We need to work for rights for all. Come, church women, heed the call. The famous preacher Olympia Brown will be at the Opera House downtown. Universalism? She'll break it down. We'll all cheer when the grumpy men frown. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. The first church of Kent, it did not fail, thanks to a preacher named Abigail.
Part 3, tenacity during hard times.
Well, the 20th century presented new challenges to the First Universalist Church of Kent. Members continued to expand their work for social justice. They took regular special collections for important causes, just like we do. Under the leadership of Reverend Carlotta Crosley, the congregation raised money to assist people who suffered from the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. They funded a Universalist mission to Japan. They took a special collection during the Great War to fund the work of a chaplain to the troops. They took a special collection for the boys' detention home in Ravenna in 1918. In the fall of 1918, the church was closed for 5 weeks because of the Spanish flu epidemic, then sweeping much of the nation and the world that killed millions of people. In 1920, lightning hit the church steeple. Here is the newspaper account from July 22nd, 1920, of what happened. Lightning struck the spire of the Universalist Church of Kent during the storm of Thursday afternoon, shattering its upper portion and setting it on fire. The standard at the top was hurled to the ground, and the frame of the steeple shattered. The firemen turned their attention to the church building, onto which they poured steady streams of water, while the steeple burned in spectacular flaming above. A great crowd of citizens assembled and watched the singular scene, the first known instance of firefighters encouraging one part of a building to burn and working like Trojans to protect the other and more important part. That's from the newspaper. The building stood, but the steeple was destroyed. In the wake of the fire, the ambitious church members launched a $1 million campaign to make repairs. They never managed to raise $1 million, but they did make repairs on the church. They never rebuilt the steeple. During the 1920s, the church membership dwindled, though the closing of the Ravenna and Brimfield churches brought new members to Kent. In 1927, membership was so low that the church dismissed the minister. The building was in desperate need of repairs. The church members appealed to the Ohio Convention for money. The convention recommended that the members sell the building and buy a house to hold services. They put the church building up for sale in 1928, but no prospective buyers came. There was also brief talk of merging with the Congregational Church. The congregation created a committee to look for a house. One of the committee members was Marjorie Fessenden, daughter of Kent businessman and church benefactor Elmer France, and she was also the great-granddaughter of church founder James Haymaker. She was determined to save the Universalist congregation in its existing home and to make the necessary repairs. She and her father, Elmer France, organized a pledge campaign that raised $13,000 from community members and businesses. They remodeled the building, and the church hired a new young minister named Carl Olson, who preached his first sermon on December 1st, 1929. Our social hall is today named for Marge Fessenden.
1929. The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
Universalism had its claim to fame, but other denominations got into the game of a loving God who didn't blame and shame. Main Street Protestants have rejected hell's flame. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. We had a church in Ravenna with plenty of members until the turn of the century when they closed and joined you and me. Our other church in Brimfield shrunk until their fate was sealed. They closed about 10 years ago. They joined us when they let go. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. We had a sanctuary that was much too airy, so we cut it in half. It really wasn't that scary. We made a nice apartment to make some money on some rent, or when we're low on cash or pledge, it could serve us as a parsonage. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. Now our church in Kent is feeling the pinch of the Great Depression. It's making us flinch. Maybe we should close and join the Trinitarians. Even though we're liberal, we're not contrarians. The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
My name is Marge Fessenden, and I know I'm not a businessman, but I'm sure not a Trinitarian. Can I hear an amen? Amen. I know this may sound funny, but I think we can raise the money so our future will be sunny. Can I hear an amen? Amen. Important is our identity as a loving faith that's also free. Let's struggle with this calamity with our usual corps d'esprit. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. But we know we can change. Yes, we know we can change. So universalism is maintained.
Part 4, Activism.
In the 1940s and 1950s, the church's fortunes improved, and the congregation grew in size. The church had a longtime minister named Reverend John Flint. Each November, the church held an election day dinner for the voters who cast ballots next door. Local political leaders and community members from all backgrounds attended and enjoyed fellowship together. We will be holding an election day dinner again this November. In 1961, the Unitarians and Universalists merged to become the Unitarian Universalist faith. And in 1965, the First Universalist Church of Kent changed its name to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Kent. The following year, in May 1966, our church held a grand celebration of our 100th anniversary. Among those present was current member Gene Wenninger. It was a time of engagement and commitment. UUs participated in the civil rights struggles of the decade and in the social justice movements of the time. Here in Kent, our church became a haven for radical thinking and for activism against the war in Vietnam. A coffee house called the Yellow Unicorn opened in the church basement, and people did draft counseling and anti-war organizing here. Church members ran a food co-op that eventually moved downtown and became the Kent Natural Foods Co-op. In 1970, a 20-year-old theology student at Oberlin College named Bill Schultz was called to serve as minister of the UU Church of Kent. The nation was divided over the Vietnam War and over conditions in urban communities. Members of our church were likewise divided over a vote to refuse to pay the church's phone tax as a protest against the Vietnam War. Some members reportedly left the church over objections to this vote. President Nixon's invasion of Cambodia stirred massive student protests around the nation, including protests on the Kent State University campus. National Guardsmen were called to Kent State and patrolled the campus while students continued attending classes. Word went out that protests were banned, but the students protested anyway. On May 4th, 1970, National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students at Kent State University and wounded 9 others in a tragedy that reverberated around the world. In the wake of the shootings, Kent Mayor Leroy Satrum declared that no more than 5 people could gather in Kent to memorialize or honor the slain students, and this ban extended even to memorial services in churches. Reverend Schultz requested permission from the mayor to hold a memorial service at our church. he received no answer. In protest against this lack of a response, the church went forward and held a memorial service for the slain students on Friday, May 8th. Reverend Schultz issued a statement criticizing the mayor for violating the principle of separation of church and state. He declared, "The citizens of Kent, Ohio must not be denied their constitutional rights of religious assembly, particularly at a time when hundreds of other communities are eulogizing the student victims." At the Sunday service on May 10th, church members and friends passed 3 resolutions. The first called for the immediate unconditional withdrawal of all American troops from Indochina. The second resolution censured the President of the United States and his administration for their harsh and irresponsible attacks on dissenters, nonconformists, students, intellectuals, and ministers, which have so recently contributed to the slaying of 4 Kent State students. The third resolution called for the county prosecutor and the mayor of Kent to respect and support the civil liberties of all individuals in Portage County, liberties which we believe have been seriously violated in recent days. The UU Church of Kent thus took a stand for free speech and assembly, for an end to the war, and for justice and respect for human dignity. Reverend Bill Schultz was with us for only 20 months, but his leadership renewed our commitment to work for justice. He went on to serve as moderator of the UUA, then to serve as head of Amnesty International USA, then to head the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, and Reverend Schultz has recently come to enjoy retirement.
1966. Our 100th anniversary was a great festivity. Our connection to our history was the core of that story. Our own Jean Wenninger and Marge Fessenden did ensure a celebration most mature. It was detailed in a gold brochure. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. Then the boomers started booming because the Army draft was looming, and the Vietnam War was consuming young men the Army was grooming. Liberals were becoming radical. Protests were becoming fashionable. Churches were becoming casual. Some events were becoming bacchanal. The world is not the same. The world is going to change. We had the SRL and the SDS. We had the Yellow Unicorn. These younger members didn't rest. We had conscientious objectors helping men avoid the war, and a board of directors who had the job to tend it all. Our basement had a food co-op, which was a little messy, but at least it wasn't a head shop. That would have been more distressing.
The world is not the same. The world is going to change. 1970.
My name is Bill Schultz, and I'm here from Oberlin. I'm an up-and-coming minister and a student of religion. I find the times we live in are really quite sobering, and I really hate the war. I'm going to fight like a Doberman.
The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
Then spring came into Kent and its infamous event. Into Cambodia, troops were sent. Kent State students were in dissent. Students' protests escalated. Governor Rhodes was agitated. National Guard was activated. 4 students were terminated.
With extreme prejudice. The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
Martial law was declared in Kent. No people were to gather for an event, but the UU Church saw a need to dissent. They hosted a service in which to lament.
The world is not the same. The world is going to change.
Those troubled times, they soon changed. The church indeed was not the same. Many ministers were exchanged, but universalism we always claimed. This past decade, we've had much to praise. Justice Project, Soulful Sundays. Our minister sermons are not essays. For our expansion, we have fundraised. Our church has been a beacon of liberal hope. Love and justice has been our scope. We hope that in our next 150 years, we'll have the courage to face all our fears.
The world is not the same. The world is going to change. The world is not the same, but our church is able to change.
As we were preparing for this celebration of our church history, Sally Burnell and I looked at photographs of church members from the past. Sally said, "They were like us." Yes, they were, Sally. They stood up for freedom of conscience and freedom of belief. They made a covenant with each other to sustain and build community. They worked for equality of women and men, equality for all people. They believed in universal compassion and universal love. Theirs was a church of the heart, though not without the head. They worried about daily problems, how to pay the bills and how to keep the building intact and open. They took special collections for important causes because they knew their efforts mattered. They honored the inherent dignity and worth of every person. They left us their legacy of doing work that mattered, of doing work that would change the world. I wish I could go back in time and tell our church founders what happened to us in 150 years, how well we preserved and extended their vision of a free faith community. I think they would be proud of us. And while I'm sure they would be shocked at how the world has changed, I think they would recognize us. I think they would see in our work for human rights, for environmental justice, for an end to poverty and suffering, the aims that they started with. I hope that they would feel at home in our community where we embrace those of different backgrounds and beliefs. I hope they would enjoy the coffee hour and empathize with our fundraising efforts and our expansion aims. They were like us, or rather, we're like them. We thank them for helping us to become who we are. They stood together for universal love. We stand together looking toward the next 150 years with a renewed commitment to inspire love, to seek justice, to grow in community. Thank you.
Amen.
Amen.